You won't have to look very far to find skeptics ruthlessly critiquing popular apologetics. But some aren't aware that many Christians are fed up with such approaches as well. For the more tribal Christians, this can cause them to accuse some of their own of leading people astray. One such person on the receiving end of such criticism is New Testament scholar Dale Allison, who wrote this book that pretty much everyone should read regardless of which side you fall on in the resurrection debate. And in this video, I'm going to be summarizing the various apologetic talking points he takes issue with. The first thing he takes aim at is an appeal to results. How could Christianity be false? Just look at what it's done for the world. Allison is not impressed with this and basically thinks it won't hold much persuasive force for anyone not already convinced. He writes, quote, "How," a skeptic might counter, "could a good God have vindicated the founder of a religion that has tolerated slavery, executed heretics, vilified Jews, terrified people with a post-mortem torture chamber, and failed, with a few recent exceptions, to regard women as equal to men? The churches, to state the obvious, are like so much else, a befuddling mixture of good and bad," unquote. Another argument put forward is the idea that given the psychological state of the disciples after Jesus' death, they wouldn't have conjured up the kinds of stories we see taking shape in the early Christian movement. They wouldn't be able to recover from the trauma of losing their leader in the way that they did, seeming to be transformed and changing their public behavior, unless the resurrection happened. But, as Allison points out, these kinds of psychological theories are almost never supported by any data. And as a side note, it is ironic that apologists slapped skeptics on the wrist for trying to psychoanalyze historical figures, only to turn around and do the exact same thing in various circumstances. But aside from that, even if we take the texts at face value, there isn't much we learn that we couldn't have reasonably guessed without them. A messianic leader was put to death, and his followers were disillusioned, fearful, and didn't quite know what to make of it. In addition, it's just false that such a situation couldn't result in the data we see. Allison summarizes a not-so-surprising pattern that emerges when religious expectations fail. Hopes dashed, confusion and despair, rationalizations, and recovery. Quote, "The social psychological fact is that people in situations not wholly dissimilar to that of the disciples immediately after Good Friday have been able to reconfigure their expectations and soldier on. Apologists should recognize this fact and either drop the defective argument from psychological death and resurrection or figure out how to render it new and improved." Unquote. For an in-depth coverage of this phenomena, see Matthew Hardkey's video, How Cognitive Dissonance Explains Christianity, that I'll have linked in the description. But what about Paul and the apostles? They went to their deaths, proclaiming the resurrection. Surely this means they were sincere, a data point highly consistent with a miraculous event. Well, it's really not that simple, actually. More often than not, this is an overblown and exaggerated talking point, something that apologist Sean McDowell has pointed out in some of his work.
And I found myself pushing back on both sides of this conversation. I pushed back on a lot of Christians, even apologists who I think overstate this argument. I had one pastor in my research, he said, "Man, you're going to make a liar out of all of us." And I said, "Man, that is not my intention, but I think we've oversold this argument."
But even his more modest proposals are too optimistic. As Allison summarizes, quote, "We in truth know next to nothing about most of these characters, who are little more than names. Even were one recklessly to imagine that Acts gives us nothing save unembellished history. The 12 disappear after Acts 6, so we know no more about most of their post-Easter lives than we know about their deaths." Unquote. Some point out that the shift in the day of worship is significant here. Why would early Christians change the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, if not for some monumental event having taken place in reality on a Sunday morning? Why ditch a day with scriptural precedents? There are a lot of disputable assumptions at play in this line of reasoning, but even supposing we accept it, quote, "A skeptic need observe only that belief in Jesus' resurrection on a Sunday, as opposed to the fact of Jesus' resurrection on a Sunday, suffices to explain why Christians gathered on that day of the week." Unquote. as Allison notes. Or maybe if you don't want to go nuts trying to harmonize everything, you might say that the disharmony of the gospel accounts in some places points to a lack of collusion, and this can be seen as a good thing. Allison doesn't buy it, but here's Matthew Hartke explaining why this doesn't work.
Regardless of what we say about the reliability of the Gospels more generally, the resurrection narratives are in a class all their own, and they're an absolute mess. Now, this is usually the point where apologists try to turn this bug into a feature by claiming that the minor discrepancies between the accounts should actually increase our confidence in the core historical claim of those accounts. But in this case especially, that's a genuinely terrible argument. Because as any interrogator worth their salt knows, what you're really looking for when interrogating witnesses and trying to get to the truth is corroboration without collusion. You want the stories to agree as much as possible, but without showing any sign of dependence on each other or copying each other to get their stories straight. But if the witnesses can't even agree on such basic things as the murder weapon or which zip code the murder happened in, and yet on other details they're repeating each other's sentences almost verbatim, nobody in their right mind would think that that should increase our level of confidence in those witnesses when they happen to agree on the identity of the murderer. So when the gospel writers can't even agree on where the risen Jesus appeared, on who he appeared to, or on what, if anything, he said when he appeared, why should we consider them to be reliable witnesses to anything other than the desires of the gospel writers themselves?
But the Shroud of Turin, you might say.
The Shroud is a mid-14th century forgery, and the Shroud first pops up in the historical record around 1354 in France. And in 1989, radiocarbon dating found that it dated to the late 13th to the mid-14th century CE. So most likely, this is a medieval forgery. Now, as with all things related to dogmas, there are going to be people who insist that the academic consensus is misguided, or it is based on lies or improper methodologies or things like that. But the argument that still convinces the majority of scholars, based on the data that are available to us today, is that the Shroud is a medieval production and does not go back to the time of Jesus.
So that was a brief overview of some of the not-so-great talking points in favor of Christian belief. Not everyone who makes bad arguments has bad intent. However, there are some questionable things apologists do to try and manipulate you. Tap the video on screen now to see what I mean.